What made you realize your partner was lying to you? In 2012, I realized my now ex-wife had been lying about a few very important parts of our 12-year marriage. Through the years, we had ups and downs, and in 2012, it all came to a head. At the time I was in school getting a degree in computer science. It was something I felt I was lacking and was holding me back, even after many years working in the field. We agreed that our children would stay with her and I would take them every Wednesday and every other weekend, and then when I finished school in a few months, we would switch to 50-50. The agreement was that instead of paying her child support, she couldn't have the extra income to qualify for a low-income apartment. I would pay all the expenses of the kids, like childcare, clothing, shoes, school supplies, etc. A month after the separation, she was dating a couple different guys and ended up settling with one who quickly moved in with her. Evidently, she found out the apartments only check income during the application process, and if you begin to earn more money or if you bring in a new resident who also has income, they don't care. I made a huge mistake, and I told my ex that I should track down the new boyfriend and let him know how messed up in the head she and her family were. Surprisingly, I received an email from him a few hours later, basically saying, "Here I am, what do you want to tell me?" I spent days writing out every detail of how she had lied and manipulated everything over the course of our relationship and how she had learned it all from her parents. The reply was basically, "All I see is a bitter ex trying to badmouth this wonderful woman." What I didn't realize was that this man was a huge narcissistic egomaniac, and somehow I had challenged his ego. Now it was his mission in life to make me pay. My ex went along because she wanted to see me suffer. They had a common enemy, and he was taking the reins. This guy took my email as an affront and a challenge. I ended up learning that he took over everything in regards to the divorce, child support, and communicating with me, while pretending to be her. After I finished school, I asked to get the kids 50-50, and we ended up in court, and I was denied because the kids were settled and supposedly didn't want the change. The kids began counseling. Then I received the papers for child support. Again, we ended up in court, and I began paying almost $1,000 a month, which is what the state said was fair based on the timeshare and our income differences. She went out and traded her 5-year-old Ford for a brand new BMW. All the while telling the kids I wasn't paying support. My ex and her boyfriend would sit around their dining table with friends, with the kids in the living room, and talk about how I was such a boss and plan how to screw me over in court. They even had a name for the group that they called the Dream Team. The more the kids heard, the more and more they resented me. My teenage son began getting lavish with gifts. A BMX bike worth thousands, bought on sale, of course. A TV and PlayStation in his bedroom, with the latest Call of Duty games, which are totally age inappropriate, and we had agreed he wouldn't be allowed to play until he was older. A mini fridge in his bedroom was stocked with Gatorade and candy bars. Brand new iPhone. Being that the kids were in counseling, the counselor would write to the courts, on behalf of my ex, and say the kids kept saying they didn't want a custody change. The odd part was that when the kids were with me, they were happy, and my daughter even mentioned a few times that she didn't understand why the timeshare wasn't even. And when I told her to talk to the counselor, she stopped talking and wouldn't respond to me for the rest of the afternoon. You see, because of the kids' schedule, all of the counseling sessions were during their mother's time, and I barely had the kids. I did have a few sessions with each child at the beginning. I would email the counselor about things the kids would say, like when they would tell me about how they were being involved in adult or court discussions, which went directly against court orders, but my ex had the counselor around her finger. I ended up learning from another counselor that my ex tried the same thing to sway the counselor against me using fabricated stories of cheating and abuse, but the second counselor didn't buy it. I think the first one did. My son was also allowed, or told, to read all the court documents that they filed. The boyfriend was a master at finding snippets of emails or text messages that looked like I was saying something totally different than what was intended when taken in context with the entire conversation or entire sentence. But of course he was never allowed to read my responses or the actual emails or conversations where the manipulated data was coming from. Of course, my responses to the court showed everything. On one afternoon, I was supposed to pick up the kids from our daughter's daycare. When I showed up, my son refused to go with me. I sent a text to my ex, asking what was going on, because he had said his mom told him he had a choice and he didn't have to come if he didn't want to. A few minutes later, the BF's car came roaring down the road, skidding to a stop in front of my car, and 3 guys jumped out of the car. The BF stayed in the driver's seat. I started my car as these guys came aggressively towards it, screaming something and throwing stuff at it. Thinking that these guys were attacking me, and with my daughter in the back seat, feeling scared of what was going to happen, I began moving forward as there was an opening on the sidewalk in front of the BF's car. As I started moving, he moved forward, pushing his bumper into the side of my car, leaving a long scratch down the side of my car and a slight indent. With my adrenaline pumping, I took off. What I found out later was that the whole thing was planned out. They convinced my son to tell me he wouldn't go with me while the boyfriend and his friends waited down the street. My son was instructed to send them a text when I got there. Evidently, what they were throwing at my car were copies of several court documents that needed to be served on me. After I left the daycare location, they called the police and filed a report that I had tried to run over my boyfriend's brother. I also contacted the police to file a report for the damage to my car, but the police basically said that if I filed a report, then they, the boyfriend and his friends, were also filing a report for assault with a deadly weapon. The weapon was the car, and based on the fact that I was alone and they had 4 witnesses, it wasn't likely to be favorable to me. Literally, I was in court over various support and custody issues and DVRO filings a couple times a month for 2 years, if not more. For the record, the DVRO was their attempt to get me to look like a violent bad guy in court. They also tried filing several cases with CPS. All of the CPS cases were dismissed as unfounded, and the DVRO was cancelled when I showed proof that they were showing up to places where they knew I would be, such as my son's soccer practices and games on my weekends. I was co-coaching and would skip games when it wasn't my weekend because of the DVRO. But once again, my son was included in everything. He knew the details of my ex's side of the DVRO filing, which showed me as a violent jerk. I kept telling my ex that she needed to stop including the kids in the stuff we were going through. I never said anything in front of the kids, except if they said something that they had heard. Then I would respond as simply as I could. Most of the time I would just say, that's between your mom and I. You shouldn't be involved in that. I sent email after email warning my ex that the more she included the kids, the more it hurt my relationship with them now. But what is it going to do to the kids later in life? I warned her that she was going to absolutely ruin her relationship with the kids when all the stress and crap she had included them in came to a head. And at some point, they will realize none of her statements were true and her actions were pure evil. The summer before my son's freshman year, I was awarded 50-50 custody through the summer, and if everything went well, then it would continue through the following school year. As was my MO, I would file for a change of support at the same time as filing for a custody hearing, and if nothing changed in the custody hearing, I would cancel the support hearing. At the support hearing, support was modified from the previous $1,000 a month to $100 a month, but she also had to repay the previous few months based on when the hearings were scheduled and when custody changed. We went back and forth a couple times, and she, her boyfriend, remember, all communication was actually with him, tried to get me to agree to all these silly terms, like if I said anything they didn't like, they could revert support back to me owing her $1,000 a month, not legal. When I refused to agree to their crazy stipulations, they went and filed another modification. Support services changed several of their policies based on our back and forth filings. They no longer allow a modification application within 6 months of a court ruling. They also no longer assist in filings in which the recipient decides to attempt any kind of collection on their own. My ex was upset that I had been awarded support, and she filed 7 counts of contempt of court or an order to show cause when support services refused to. What made you realize your partner was lying to you? The counts were dropped when we showed up for court based on lack of cause, but she tried to use the filing in one negotiation as blackmail of sorts. After she was having to pay me, the way they were treating our son went from all these toys and over-the-top gifts being taken away. Our son was failing almost all of his classes because he was allowed to play video games all night. I would see him online at 1 a.m. on a school night, and homework was not a thing. But now that they lost in court and manipulating him against me wouldn't work anymore, his phone was taken away, and the TV and PlayStation were taken away. The fridge and bike were sold. And now every little act was a major infraction. According to her, he became this horrible child in her house. He began realizing that he was only treated so well when it mattered for them to use him to get support and to try and control me and hurt me. I wanted more time with the kids, so using the kids against me was hurting me. He also started asking about incidents that had occurred throughout the last few years, telling me what he saw and what he was told, and I would tell him my side and show him evidence of what was actually going on. 2 weeks into summer and the new 50-50 schedule, my son came to me and asked if he could come live with me full-time and only see his mom on alternating weekends. The way he was being treated was like a red-headed stepchild, and he was miserable. That same weekend, my ex sent me an email saying that his behavior had risen to a level she could not handle anymore and that it was in his best interest to come live with me more than 50-50. But because it wasn't fair and even she wanted me to give up an equal amount of time with our daughter, I said that he could live with me more, but that this would have no impact on our daughter's time with me. I would continue to have her 50-50. Her reply was that if I would not agree to make things fair, then she would just put up with our son's behavior, even though her words were that it was in his best interest to be with me. Eventually, it came out that she was more worried that I was going to go and ask for support. I agreed to zero support, in the interest of our son, on the condition that she agreed to pay for half of our son's expenses, such as clothing, school supplies, etc., and I was already paying for half of all of our daughter's expenses. The more time my son spent with me, the more he would ask about things. He was in counseling, and we would go over everything. He ended up getting into some legal trouble over some things he had done while at his mom's house. She ended up completely cutting off contact with him, and her boyfriend, now fiancé, insisted that she file for a restraining order against her son, which she did. He had to appear in court and sit across the courtroom while his mother begged the judge for a permanent restraining order. The judge explained that the maximum he could issue was 5 years, and that wasn't warranted, but he did issue one pending the outcome of the juvenile court's decision on the other legal matters. She began bawling and begging for a longer restraining order. She was denied. The support agreement we had fell apart when I sent a couple bills to my ex. One was for an uncovered medical expense and the other was for a pair of shoes. By law, all medical expenses are split 50-50, no matter what. She refused to pay anything. I reminded her about the agreement and the state laws and warned her that if she continued to not pay as was our agreement, I would be forced to go back to court to seek support, as was my right. I did not get a reply. Instead, my stepfather, who I was renting a couple rooms from at the time, got an email from the fiancée in which he said that any further request for money from her, which was taking food out of my daughter's mouth, would be met with serious legal issues both for me and my son. I went to the courts and filed for support the next day. The same day that service was delivered to my ex, a letter was drafted to the district attorney handling my son's case in which the fiancé made claims of unfit parenting and abuse and requested that my son be taken from me immediately and placed full-time in either juvenile detention or a live-in counseling facility. This was largely ignored when my son's attorney presented the threatening email in response to a request for reimbursement of expenses. Since this was all part of my son's legal issues, he had to be included in the conversations and copied on the letters. Part of his legal issues required him to spend a few weekends in juvenile detention. At this point, he had been living with me 100% for almost a year, and between the courtroom antics and the lies and manipulation he now knew about, he really had no desire to see his mother, but the counselor he was seeing was working towards reunification as one of the goals, dealing with his anger with his mother, part of which is what she attributes his legal issues to. The nuptials to the BF fell apart a day or two before the wedding, which they both tried to blame on my son and then on me. Now that the controller was gone, she was trying to work her way back into our son's life, but he was refusing to see her. We had worked out a few things with her parents, and he was spending time with them until, against the counselor's direction, they tried to convince him to go see his mom. This made him angry, and he no longer wanted to see them. One of the weekends he was supposed to spend in detention fell on a weekend that I was out of town, and I was going to be unable to pick him up on Sunday, having been fed up with less than zero assistance. It was a really difficult couple of years, and not only did my ex do nothing, I was driving to the city once a week for his counseling, to pick up and drop off our daughter, and lots of other stressful and time-consuming things. My ex, on the other hand, had lots of free time, no kids, had to do zero traveling for pickups, etc. So I sent her an email saying that I needed her to arrange for our son to be picked up from detention, and I warned her that she should not be the one picking him up, and worst case scenario, she should sign him out of detention and have an Uber waiting to take him home. She had plenty of options she could have chosen. Her sister and my family are always willing to help, and she is still in contact on one level or another with all of them. Instead, she said she had no options and would have to pick him up. I contacted his counselor and asked her to call my ex and warn her of the ramifications if she tried to force her way back into his life and that it could set counseling back. She refused, and on the day of pickup, she was the one there waiting for him, pretending everything was great and that she had never done anything wrong. Not even so much as an apology for the vile things she had done, said, allowed to happen, or tried to happen. Once in the car, she refused to go anywhere, trying to convince him that he would be better off living with her parents, and she was ready to take him there if he agreed. They spent half an hour in the parking lot, and he just kept telling her no, I want to go home, to my dad's house. Eventually, she gave up and drove him home. The counselor, after finding this out, changed her tactics. Where she had spent months trying to counsel him on how to deal with his anger and forgive his mother, she was now counseling him on how people in our lives may do things that aren't in our best interest and we can live our lives without toxic people, no matter who they are in relation to us, and that it's not worth holding an anger about, and it's okay to forgive so he can move on and have a successful life without his mother in her. I.e., no more plan to reunify. My son is now almost 19. He hasn't seen his mother since the day she picked him up from detention 4 years ago. Last summer, my ex started again with the lies and manipulation, this time with our daughter. Things like when I was trying to get her into a summer camp, my ex decided to get our daughter all excited about a baking competition, then emailed me and said, this is where she wants to go, so you can either let me have her for that time, or you can arrange to pick her up and drop her off every day. The problem was that the baking thing was about 45 minutes away from my house or work, but it was near my ex's work, and it was only half days, so I would have to drive to drop her off at 8 a.m. I start work at 6 a.m., then go back to work, drive to pick her up at noon, drive across town to drop her off at another half-day camp, then drive and pick her up after I was off work. Or, of course, I could give up my time with my daughter. And, as I said, my ex had already told our daughter about the thing, and she was all excited to go. So, if I said no, then I would be the bad guy. So I agreed to let her go, and I would do all the driving, and I included in the response email that the actions she had taken were exactly duplicating what she had done with our son and that they went directly against several court orders. I warned her and said if the actions continued, she was risking losing her daughter the way she lost her son. I included the emails I had sent years prior that said that she was going to completely destroy her relationship with her children if she continued to lie and manipulate them and use them as pawns in this game she was playing. Look at what happened. She had done exactly that once already and was on the path to do it again. I never actually said I told you so, but the gist is the same.